Federal agents once searched Jack and Charlie's on West 52nd Street in Manhattan for 5 straight hours and found nothing. No bottles, no cases, no evidence. The bar itself had rotated back into the wall. 2,000 cases of wine were sitting behind a 2.5-ton brick door in the basement of the building next door, opened by a metal skewer pushed through a crack in the brickwork. That door cost real money. The cousins who owned the 21 Club only built it after federal agents raided them in 1930 and took their stock. That is the detail almost everyone misses about speakeasies. The secret doors and the sliding shelves and the sewer chutes were not romantic touches. They were capital expenditure, and somebody sat down and decided they were worth the price. So let's do what almost nobody does with prohibition. Let's look at the books. In 1925, in the Little Italy neighborhood of Chicago, the Genna brothers ran one of the most efficient alcohol operations in the country. They handed out 1-gallon copper stills, called Alki cookers, to hundreds of families in cramped apartments across the neighborhood. They supplied the corn sugar and the yeast. They paid each household about $15 a day to keep the still running on the kitchen stove. The alcohol coming out of those apartments cost the Guinness somewhere between 50 and 75 cents a gallon. They sold it to speakeasies for $6. Sit with that number for a moment. That is an 8-fold return before the liquor has even reached a customer. And the speakeasy that bought that gallon then cut it with water, colored it with caramel or juniper oil, poured it into a bottle with a forged Canadian label, and sold it by the glass at a price where 4 or 5 drinks covered the wholesale cost of the entire gallon. In New York, the numbers look similar. Commercial stills in the city could turn out 50 to 100 gallons a day at a production cost of about 50 cents per gallon. And that gallon sold for anywhere between $3 and $12, depending on quality and buyer. On paper, this was the best margin in American business. Nothing legal came close. Not steel, not automobiles, not the stock market that everyone in 1928 was so excited about. So why did nearly everyone in that supply chain end up broke, imprisoned, or dead? Because that markup was never profit. Economists have a name for what those numbers actually represent. It is a risk premium, and prohibition produced one of the purest examples of it in modern history, in my opinion. Alcohol did not become more expensive to make when the 18th Amendment took effect in January of 1920. Corn was still corn. Copper was still copper. The chemistry did not change. What changed was that every single step between the grain and the glass now carried a chance of prison, seizure, robbery, or a bullet. The price went up to compensate whoever absorbed that chance, and a speakeasy operator, standing behind a bar in a Manhattan basement, was absorbing more of it than anyone. Start with what it took just to open the doors. A speakeasy needed a room, and that room had to be leasable by someone who would not ask questions, in a building whose owner would tolerate what happened downstairs. It needed a second exit, because a room with one door is a trap. It needed a false front, which is why so many speakeasies operated behind soda fountains, laundries, flower shops, and unmarked townhouse entrances on quiet residential streets in New York and Chicago. Then it needed the concealment work itself. The 21 Club system, designed by an architect named Frank Buchanan, included camouflage doors, invisible chutes, and bar shelves engineered to release on a lever so the entire stock dropped into the sewer within seconds. That is bespoke construction. That is an architect's fee, a contractor who keeps quiet, and materials hauled into a midtown building without a permit. Every dollar of that was spent producing exactly 0 drinks. And all of it ran on cash. Cash eliminated the paper trail, which meant it also eliminated normal accountability, so profits were skimmed constantly by everyone who touched them. Money got laundered through restaurants, laundries, and nightclubs that existed as financial camouflage as much as commerce. An operator could not audit anything, could not sue anyone, could not insure a single item on the premises. When a bartender stole from the register in a Greenwich Village basement, the owner's only enforcement mechanism was violence, and violence attracts police attention. Now the supply chain, which is where most operators actually failed. A speakeasy needed liquor arriving on a schedule. Not once. Every week, forever, without interruption. That meant relationships with whoever controlled the flow into the city. Whether that was rum runners bringing Canadian whiskey down from the border, boats sitting offshore on what newspapers called Rum Row, or the enormous domestic trade in diverted industrial alcohol. Redundancy was survival, rather than efficiency. A single disrupted route could collapse an entire operation unless alternatives already existed. A bar with one supplier was a bar that would be closed within a month of that supplier's arrest. Which is why reliable suppliers became more valuable than armed protection. Consistency kept the whole system stable, and inconsistency killed customers. Literally, here is the part of the speakeasy story that the cocktail bars trading on the aesthetic today never mention. Industrial alcohol was legal, and enormous quantities of it existed in warehouses across the country. To keep people from drinking it, the federal government required it to be denatured, and one common additive approved by the government was wood alcohol, which causes nerve damage, blindness, and death when swallowed. Officials assumed nobody could remove it. Gangsters hired chemists to try anyway. They heated the alcohol and stripped out part of the additive, but dangerous traces remained in the finished product. That liquor, known as smoke or rotgut, went into mixed drinks in basement bars across America. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas puts the death toll from tainted alcohol during Prohibition as high as 50,000 people. That figure is hard to verify, and other historians give lower estimates, but nobody disputes the direction. Deaths from alcohol poisoning and alcoholism rose sharply during the very years alcohol was banned. And notice what this did to the drink itself. The cocktail as we know it, with its citrus and sugar and mint and ginger ale, exists in its modern form largely because speakeasy bartenders were desperately covering the taste of alcohol that might blind you. The garnish was a symptom. For an operator, this was a product liability problem with no legal existence. Serve a bad batch in a crowded room in Brooklyn, and you get sick customers. Then a reputation collapse. Then police attention, in that order. There was no recall, no supplier warranty, no lab. There was only the question of whether the man delivering your barrels was cheating you, and no way to find out until someone in your bar went blind. If this breakdown is useful to you, subscribe. I cover the hidden economics of black markets and forgotten industries every week. Now let's talk about the single largest cost that never appeared in any ledger. Protection. When the Volstead Act took effect, the federal government provided a force of prohibition agents that numbered just 1,520 men in 1920. 1,520 men to stop drinking in a nation of more than 100 million people. By 1930, the force had grown to only a little over 2,800. Their pay tells the rest of the story. Agents' salaries in 1920 mostly ranged between $1,200 and $2,000 a year, which works out to roughly $35 to $40 a week. By 1930, they had been raised to somewhere between $2,300 and $2,800. The total initial federal appropriation for enforcing the Volstead Act came to $2.1 million. As the historian Daniel Okrent noted, that was slightly less than the amount paid in a single day for muskrat pelts at the St. Louis fur auction. So consider the arithmetic from inside a speakeasy on a Manhattan side street. A bootlegger could hand a federal agent more than a month's salary in a single evening. and barely noticed the expense. The agent, standing in a doorway on $40 a week, watched cash move past him all night that he could never earn in a decade. The results were exactly what you would expect. Police officers looked the other way during deliveries. Prohibition agents tipped off owners before raids. Judges dismissed cases. Politicians accepted payments in exchange for protection. By 1930, nearly 1,600 out of roughly 17,800 federal prohibition employees had been fired for offenses ranging from bribery and embezzlement to perjury and robbery. And that is only the ones who got caught. For the speakeasy operator, this created a recurring monthly cost that behaved like nothing in a legitimate business. Rent is fixed by contract. Protection is fixed by whoever is currently standing in your doorway. Pay the precinct captain, and a federal agent arrives who owes the precinct nothing. Pay them both, and a new captain gets appointed. There was no contract, no receipt, and no recourse when the price went up, which it always did. Then, the government raised the stakes on the legal side. From the beginning, the Volstead Act declared any location where liquor was illegally made, sold, or stored to be a public nuisance. And under the padlock provision, federal agents could obtain a court order shutting the building down for up to a year. Think about what that meant for an operator. The seized liquor was replaceable. The location was not. Padlocking destroyed the lease, the fit-out, the hidden cellar, and the entire customer base that knew the address, all in one afternoon. Then, on March 2nd, 1929, President Coolidge signed the Jones Act, sometimes called the 5 and 10 Law. It upgraded first offense violations to felonies carrying fines of up to $10,000 and prison terms of up to 5 years. $10,000 in 1929 for a first offense against a federal agent earning under $3,000 a year. The law was so disproportionate that critics argued it clogged the federal courts and turned public sympathy decisively against prohibition. But for anyone standing behind a bar in a Chicago basement in 1929, the calculation had just changed permanently. The risk premium had to rise again, and every price on the menu with it. And there was one more category of cost, the one that never appears in any economic model. Sherman Billingsley was a former bootlegger from Enid, Oklahoma, who opened the Stork Club on West 58th Street in 1929. He had mob partners, as almost every significant New York club did. Those partners had rivals. One of those rivals, a gunman named Vincent Call, known in the newspapers as Mad Dog, kidnapped Billingsley and held him for ransom. Billingsley survived and became the sole owner of the club. Then, Prohibition agents raided the Stork Club in 1931, and he had to move the whole operation to East 51st Street. That is the complete picture of a speakeasy's risk profile, in my opinion. The government could padlock you. Your suppliers could poison your customers. Your protection could be outbid, and the men who financed you could be kidnapped by their competitors. So how did any of it work? The demand side is the answer, and it was extraordinary. Estimates of the number of speakeasies operating in New York City alone range from 20,000 to 100,000, and Police Commissioner Grover Whalen put the figure at 32,000 around 1929. Nobody knows the real number, partly because illegal businesses do not file returns, and partly because Whalen was an aggressive prohibition supporter, with every reason to make the problem sound enormous. But even the low estimate describes a market that had simply relocated. The corner saloon on a New York street had moved to the back of a store, or one flight up, under a new name. And the successful clubs did something clever with all that risk. They stopped selling alcohol as the product. Places like the Stork Club and Texas Ginnon's rooms sold an evening. Cover charges at the door. Elaborate dinners at inflated prices. Live jazz. A hostess who knew your name. Food revenue mattered enormously, because a plate of chicken carries no criminal penalty, and no poisoning risk. And because a room full of people paying $5 to sit down is a room with revenue that survives a liquor seizure. The Guinness's $6 gallon paid for the alcohol. The cover charge and the dinner menu paid for everything else. Which brings us to the ending. And the ending is the most brutal economics in the whole story. On December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, and prohibition was repealed. The Great Depression had made the argument unanswerable. The federal government had lost something in the region of $11 billion in alcohol tax revenue across those years, while spending hundreds of millions on enforcement, and some states had previously drawn as much as 3/4 of their budgets from alcohol taxes. A bankrupt country wanted its tax base back. And the moment repeal happened, the entire business model evaporated, not because the police got better, because the risk premium disappeared. Every dollar of that 8-fold markup existed only because the product was illegal. Legalize it, and liquor becomes what it always physically was, which is a cheap agricultural commodity. The secret doors became decoration. The bribes bought nothing. The supply chain that had required smugglers and chemists and armed men was replaced by a truck with a license plate. Jack Crindler and Charlie Burns understood this better than almost anyone. Their 2.5-ton brick door in the basement under 19 West 52nd Street kept working right through repeal, holding 2,000 cases of wine for the next several decades. Only now it was legal, and the room eventually became a private dining room, seating around 20 guests. That is the whole lesson of the speakeasy economy, and it applies to every prohibited market since. The 900% margin was never a business opportunity. It was a bill, and the people who collected it paid it in prison sentences, in poisoned customers, in ransom payments, and in the money handed to a man in a doorway earning $40 a week. The illegal bar was not a gold mine. It was a toll booth, in my opinion, and the operator was standing on both sides of it.